AITA for refusing to help my ex-wife's husband after she spent years making me the joke? My name is Ethan. I'm 40 years old, and my ex-wife, Vanessa, is the same person who spent years telling everyone that she had no choice but to leave because I made her world feel too small. I was the kind of man who would get up in the middle of the night to repair a broken dishwasher, remember exactly how everyone liked their coffee, and stay quiet whenever letting a joke slide seemed easier than starting an argument. For a long time, I convinced myself that keeping my cool was the mature thing to do. Now that I look back on it, I realize I was also making it easy for Vanessa to turn me into the punchline. We were married long enough that people assumed they understood everything about our relationship. The truth was, they only knew the version she wanted them to hear. They knew the story Vanessa loved telling over dinner, while having drinks, or inside that old group chat that somehow survived long after half the people in it had stopped getting along. Early on, I truly believed our differences made us a good match. Vanessa thrived anywhere there was a crowd. She loved fancy restaurants, flattering lighting, long birthday posts on social media, and the attention of people who had never seen what she was like on her worst days. I was the opposite. I preferred making plans that would still make sense 6 months later instead of chasing whatever seemed exciting for the next 5 minutes. I liked paying bills ahead of time, keeping track of warranties, handling disagreements behind closed doors, and keeping personal struggles private instead of turning them into entertainment. At first, Vanessa called those qualities dependable. Later, she started calling them boring. Eventually, she graduated to calling them embarrassing. The shift happened so slowly that I barely noticed it while it was happening. It began with little comments during dinners. "Ethan means it in a more simple way," she'd say with a laugh, acting like she was helping explain me. Or she'd grin and add, "He's not exactly someone who takes risks. He likes to play it safe." If I ordered something ordinary from the menu, she'd tease me about it. If I shared a story without making myself sound impressive, she'd interrupt and polish it until it barely sounded like something I'd actually said. Whenever someone complimented me for being reliable, she'd tilt her head with a smile and reply, "Well, that's certainly one way to describe him." Everyone laughed because Vanessa had a talent for making cruelty sound charming. She never started with a direct hit. Instead, she'd poke a little, smile the whole time, and make everyone think I was laughing right along with them. I wasn't. But I also refused to argue with her in front of other people. Public fights always made me uncomfortable. I hated watching the mood in a room change the moment a couple decided to spill all their problems across the dinner table. So I'd force a smile, steer the conversation somewhere else, and tell myself I was choosing peace instead of conflict. By the last year of our marriage, Vanessa had turned my calm personality into a flaw she could put on display whenever she wanted. If I suggested waiting before making another expensive purchase, I was suddenly narrow-minded. If I wasn't interested in chasing whatever exciting new idea had grabbed her attention that week, then I supposedly had no ambition. And if I stayed calm while she tried to provoke me, that meant I was weak. I still remember one dinner with Natalie and 2 other friends. Vanessa smiled and said, "Ethan is really built for supporting roles. Honestly, it's kind of sweet." Natalie raised her wine glass and laughed. Every star needs someone managing the stage. Everyone around the table chuckled. I remember staring at the little circle of water beneath my glass, thinking to myself, asterisk say something, asterisk anything, asterisk, but the words never came out. Driving home afterward, I finally told Vanessa that her joke had bothered me. She kept looking through the windshield and said, "You always take everything so personally." It was about me. "It was just a joke, Ethan. You keep making the same joke." She let out a long sigh, like I'd just asked her to carry a couch up 3 flights of stairs. Maybe if you gave people something different to say about you, they would. That was Vanessa at her sharpest. She rarely insulted someone directly. Instead, she made it sound like the real problem was that you hadn't become a person worth respecting. When our marriage finally ended, I never tried to play dirty. I easily could have. I knew plenty of things. I knew about the financial mistakes she'd made. I knew about the debts she'd hidden until they suddenly became our shared problem. I still had the messages she sent after we separated, asking me to cover payments because she didn't want anyone finding out how bad her finances had become. I had documents, screenshots, bank transfers, everything. Even so, I refused to turn our divorce into a public spectacle. So when Vanessa started telling everyone that I'd held her back, I said nothing. When she claimed she'd finally escaped a small life, I stayed silent. When an old friend told me she was saying I'd taken things from her during the divorce, I still kept my mouth shut. The truth was exactly the opposite. I'd given up claims I legally could have pursued, and I'd quietly paid off shared debt, just so she wouldn't have to look embarrassed in front of the same people who were now calling me bitter. I kept telling myself that anyone who truly mattered would eventually ask for my side of the story. Almost nobody ever did. The old friend group didn't cut me off with some dramatic confrontation. Honestly, that might have been easier. Instead, they just slowly grew colder. The invitations stopped. The messages became shorter. Inside the group chat, people would respond around me instead of replying to me directly. Natalie stayed firmly by Vanessa's side, laughing at every little post-divorce freedom joke as though someone was paying her to keep the applause going. Derek was one of the very few people who never bought into the act. He'd known me before Vanessa entered my life, while we were married, and after everything fell apart. He had a blunt way of speaking that sometimes made me want to throw a napkin at his head. But he was loyal. He never dressed up the truth just to make it easier to hear. A few weeks before the fundraiser dinner, Derek came over with takeout and caught me staring at an invitation on my phone. It was for a fundraiser being held in a private dining room, and Catherine was one of the organizers. Catherine was older than most of us. She was kind without being naive, and she always seemed to notice the exact moment a room started becoming unnecessarily cruel. After sending the formal invitation, she'd followed it with a personal message. "Ethan, I know things have gotten complicated with the group, but I'd really like you to come. No pressure." Derek leaned over my shoulder, read it, and frowned. "Vanessa going?" "Yeah. She's listed as a sponsor with Adrian." Adrian was her new husband. I'd only met him once before, very briefly. Everything about him looked polished. He wore an expensive watch. His handshake was firm. He was the type of man who repeated your name twice during a conversation because he'd probably read somewhere that it made people like him more. Derek leaned back in one of my kitchen chairs. "Then this isn't really a dinner," he said. "It's a stage." "That's a little dramatic." "You were married to dramatic." I gave him a look. He immediately raised both hands. "I'm not telling you not to go. Catherine's one of the good ones. I'm saying that if you go, keep your eyes open. Vanessa doesn't reconnect with people. She performs. I can survive a few jokes. You shouldn't have to survive getting sanded down in public every time she wants an audience to applaud." I didn't have an answer for that. Derek pointed his plastic fork toward me. "You don't have to outshout her. That's never been who you are. But stop confusing silence with dignity when staying quiet costs you your own name." That hit me harder than I wanted to admit. "So," I asked, "what exactly do you think I should do?" "Go if you want." I'd started thinking about leaving if Vanessa turned the evening into another performance. And if she did, I wasn't going to fight her for everyone's attention. I was simply going to make sure the truth stayed intact. At the time, I figured Derek was talking about keeping my emotions in check. I had no idea his advice would end up being far more literal than either of us realized. The night of the dinner, I nearly got back into my car before I even walked inside. Standing in the parking lot, I looked through the front windows and saw warm lighting, people dressed in jackets and nice dresses, and a small check-in table by the entrance with neatly arranged name tags. From the outside, it looked completely harmless. Then again, most painful places do until you actually step back into them. Even so, I walked through the door. Catherine noticed me almost immediately, before I had the chance to second-guess my decision. "Ethan," she said with a gentle touch on my arm, "I'm really glad you came. Thanks for inviting me. I mean it. I know things within the group have gotten complicated." That was classic Catherine. It was her way of admitting she knew people hadn't behaved well, without pointing fingers before she'd seen everything for herself. I couldn't blame her for that. Most people would rather accept the easy version of a story than spend time digging for the truth. The private dining room held one long table that had been carefully prepared with printed menus, folded napkins, place cards, and donation envelopes resting beside every water glass. Small flower arrangements ran down the center, and fundraiser packets had been placed neatly at each seat. Around the room, people stood in little groups making awkward small talk, pretending not to notice who was deliberately avoiding eye contact with whom. Then I found the seating chart. My name sat near the middle of the table. Directly across from me were Vanessa and Adrian. Catherine saw exactly where my eyes stopped and gave a small, apologetic wince. "I didn't make the final seating assignments," she said quietly. "It's okay." She looked unconvinced. Honestly, I wasn't completely convinced myself. Vanessa had already arrived. One hand rested casually on Adrian's arm while she laughed at something Natalie had just said. She looked comfortable, not necessarily happy, confident. Vanessa always seemed to shine brightest whenever she believed she'd arranged the room exactly the way she wanted it. The moment she spotted me, her smile froze for the briefest second before returning even brighter than before. "Ethan," she said. "Wow. I honestly wasn't sure you'd come." Catherine invited me. "Well, how nice." Adrian reached his hand across the table. "Good to see you again, Ethan." "You too." His handshake was solid, almost as if he wanted everyone nearby to notice how firm it was. While we shook hands, his eyes gave me a quick once-over. It wasn't obvious enough for anyone else to call rude, but I could still feel him sizing me up. Natalie leaned forward with a wine glass already in her hand. This almost feels like the old days. Not exactly, I replied. The smile on her face tightened. Still serious, huh? Instead of answering, I took my seat before I said something I'd regret. For the first 20 minutes, dinner felt normal in the uncomfortable way these kinds of gatherings usually do. People asked about work without caring much about the answers. Someone complained about finding parking. Someone else talked about a delayed flight. The servers brought out appetizers, and everyone focused on passing plates around the table while pretending there wasn't a giant crack running straight through the room. Vanessa waited patiently until everyone had relaxed a little and the first real wave of laughter had settled in. Adrian was explaining the fundraiser's goals, talking about supporting a community project through private funding. He sounded polished and confident, like he'd rehearsed every word. A fundraiser packet sat open in front of him, one finger resting near the sponsor list. Vanessa smiled across the table at me. Ethan always preferred helping from behind the scenes with this kind of thing. A few people let out quiet laughs. I took a slow sip of water. Depends what we're talking about. Oh, I don't mean that in a bad way, she said, placing a hand dramatically over her chest. You know that. You've always been more comfortable working behind the scenes. Natalie immediately jumped in. Some people are just better at keeping the lights on while everyone else handles the big scary stuff. There it was. The first little jab. I looked directly at Natalie. That's certainly one way to describe it. She laughed much louder than necessary, acting as though I joined in instead of refusing to become part of the joke. Adrian watched the exchange with a polite smile. I could tell he'd heard these stories before. Not the real stories. Vanessa's version. The version where I was dependable but boring. Useful but forgettable. Kind enough, yet never impressive. The temporary husband she'd supposedly outgrown on her way to someone better. Vanessa kept feeding the room little comments every few minutes. When someone mentioned organizing an event, she smiled and said, Ethan would have probably made a spreadsheet just for the napkins. Later, when another guest started talking about taking chances in life, she tilted her head toward me. Some people want a bigger life, she said. Other people are perfectly happy with a quieter one. Neither is wrong. By themselves, those words sounded harmless. That was exactly why they worked. If I pushed back, I'd look thin-skinned. If I stayed silent, everyone quietly accepted the picture she was painting. So instead of reacting, I paid attention. I noticed who laughed because they genuinely thought it was funny. I noticed who laughed simply because everyone else did. I noticed Catherine's smile slowly disappear. And I noticed Adrian becoming more comfortable every time Vanessa landed another comment without hearing anything back from me. Then my attention drifted to the packet sitting in front of him. At first, it wasn't the entire folder that caught my eye. It was the project name printed in bold across the second page. I recognized it immediately. I'd seen that exact name 3 weeks earlier in a pitch deck that had been forwarded to the private investment group I worked with. I wasn't the loudest voice in that group, and honestly, I preferred it that way. I never advertised my role. I didn't mention it at parties. I didn't put it in my bio. Still, when certain projects came up for approval, my opinion carried weight. Sometimes, it carried a lot of weight. Adrian's proposal happened to be one of those projects. The presentation had arrived with a polished deck, a detailed timeline, and a request for private funding before the next phase. I remembered the email chain clearly because, while the team had plenty of ambition, there were several weak spots in the proposal. I'd asked some pointed questions before anyone was willing to move it forward. My eyes shifted from the packet back to Adrian. He had absolutely no idea. That was the exact moment the evening stopped being amusing and became something much more interesting. Not because I suddenly wanted revenge. Not entirely. There is a strange kind of peace that settles over you when you realize the person who spent years trying to make you feel insignificant has unknowingly brought the evidence that could expose them into the room. Adrian tapped the folder in front of him. We're really hoping the final approval meeting goes well. A private investment group is reviewing the project right now. Vanessa quickly reached over and touched his sleeve. Don't bore everyone with business details, she said with a laugh. Adrian smiled back at her. But for just a second, I caught a flash of irritation in his eyes. It's not boring, he replied. It's the whole reason we're here. I just mean that not everyone follows this kind of thing. As she said it, she looked directly at me. Without saying a word, I simply folded my napkin neatly across my lap. Catherine noticed. Her eyes moved from Vanessa to me, then to the packet sitting in front of Adrian. She didn't know what I knew, but she knew something in the room had just changed. Dinner continued as though nothing had happened. The salads were served, people ate, and before long the plates were cleared away. Natalie started telling everyone about a recent trip she'd taken, and somehow she managed to work Vanessa's divorce into the story. She smiled toward Vanessa, and said she'd really come alive after ending her marriage. Vanessa gave a humble little shrug. I think I finally stopped making myself smaller. Adrian looked at her with obvious admiration. That's one of the things I respect most about her. For a brief second, I actually felt sorry for him. Only for a second. Adrian wasn't a bad person. He was arrogant, sure. And he was more than willing to believe the version of me that made him feel like the better man. But he was also sitting beside the woman he loved, completely convinced she'd told him the truth. I could see how thoroughly she'd shaped the way he saw me. Every polite question he asked carried a hidden edge. The difference was that he genuinely believed those little cuts were deserved. Then it was time for the toast. The organizer thanked everyone for supporting the fundraiser. Catherine stood next, offering a few heartfelt words of appreciation for everyone who had come. People lifted their glasses. That should have been the end of it. Vanessa had other plans. She rose just enough from her chair to catch everyone's attention without making it look like she'd intentionally taken over the room. I just want to say something, she began, smiling warmly around the table. Evenings like this remind me how important it is to build a life that actually fits who you are. She paused. For a long time, I confused feeling safe with being truly happy. A few pairs of eyes drifted toward me. Vanessa's expression stayed gentle. Her voice stayed warm. She really was good at this. I've learned that sometimes the only way to make room for the right life is by leaving the wrong one behind. You stop making yourself small. You stop apologizing for wanting more. And if you're lucky, she smiled toward Adrian, you find yourself with someone who's not afraid of ambition. Natalie clapped first, far louder than anyone else. Yes. A few others awkwardly raised their glasses in agreement. I stayed completely still. Adrian looked pleased with himself. Then he glanced at me with the quiet confidence of a man who believed the room had just confirmed he was the upgrade. Leaning back in his chair, he smiled. So, Ethan, what are you doing these days? Still quietly keeping everything running in the background? A ripple of soft laughter moved around the table. Not much, just enough. Vanessa smirked. I lowered my eyes to the fundraiser packet sitting in front of Adrian. Then I let the silence linger for 1 second longer than anyone found comfortable. Finally, I reached over, gently slid the packet back toward him with 2 fingers, and said, You pitched this project to me last month. For a moment, nobody understood what I'd meant. Natalie even laughed again, although this time it sounded uncertain. What does that even mean? Adrian's smile was still there, but everything around it had frozen. I nodded toward the folder. Your proposal. The private funding group you're waiting to hear from. I was on the review call. Vanessa laughed immediately. Too quickly. Ethan. She forced another smile. Oh, come on. I looked directly at her. What? This really isn't the time to exaggerate. The room became quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence. A few moments earlier, everyone had been waiting to see whether I'd lose my temper. Now they were waiting to find out whether I was telling the truth. I stayed calm. Natalie slowly lowered her wine glass. I mean, Ethan always had a habit of making himself sound more important than he really was. That almost made me laugh. I'd spent years doing the exact opposite. Adrian's voice lost its confidence. Which investment group? Without saying another word, I unlocked my phone, opened my email, and pulled up the message thread. I didn't hold it up dramatically. I didn't start reading emails aloud like we were in a courtroom. I simply turned the screen toward Adrian. He could clearly see the sender, the project title, the meeting date, and my name listed with the final decision group. His face changed instantly. Recognition arrived before his pride had time to stop it. Wait, he said quietly. That's your group. One of them. And for this project, I'm part of the final review. Nobody touched the food anymore. A server walked in carrying another bottle of wine, immediately sensed the tension hanging over the table, quietly turned around, and slipped back out as though he'd accidentally wandered into a Thanksgiving family argument. Vanessa's cheeks turned bright red. So this was your plan? She snapped. You came here to embarrass me? No. I met her eyes. I came because Catherine invited me. You sat there waiting for the perfect moment. I sat here while you kept making jokes. They were jokes. Catherine finally spoke. Her voice stayed calm, but there was no uncertainty in it. I don't think they sounded like jokes. Vanessa blinked at her, almost offended that someone had stepped outside the role she'd assigned them. Natalie rushed in to defend her. Okay, but everyone's acting like Vanessa attacked him. She was just talking about how much she'd grown. I looked at Natalie. By calling me the wrong life? She opened her mouth to answer. Nothing came out. Vanessa leaned toward me. You don't get to punish me just because I moved on. I'm not punishing you for moving on. My voice never rose. I'm refusing to sit here while you rewrite my life for everyone's entertainment. Adrian was still staring at the email thread on my phone. I could almost watch the pieces falling into place inside his head. Every joke Vanessa had repeated. Every story she'd told. Every version of me she'd carefully built for him. The harmless ex. The forgettable man. The one safely beneath him. Then Natalie proved she still didn't know when to stop talking. It's not like Vanessa invented everything, she muttered. You came out of the divorce just fine. Natalie. Vanessa's sharp interruption told the room far more than Natalie's words ever could. Catherine turned toward Vanessa. What exactly does that mean? It doesn't mean anything, Vanessa answered quickly. I set my phone down on the table. It means Vanessa told people I took things from her during the divorce. Adrian slowly turned his head toward his wife. Vanessa's voice immediately hardened. Don't. I looked at her for several long seconds. There had been a time when hearing that tone would have made me back down. Not because I feared Vanessa. Because I feared becoming the kind of person who enjoyed exposing someone else's mistakes. I still didn't enjoy it. But I was finished acting as the locked box that protected the lies she handed out at parties. I'm not going to tell everyone everything, I said quietly. But I'm also not letting that lie keep living. Natalie looked genuinely shaken. I didn't know it was like that. You never asked. Vanessa shot me another glare. You always do this. You stay calm so everyone assumes you're the reasonable one. I am calm. You're calculated. Tonight. I nodded. Yes. That answer silenced her far more effectively than shouting ever could have. Adrian spoke without raising his voice. What actually happened during the divorce? Vanessa immediately turned toward him. Not here. He didn't take his eyes off her. You're the one who brought him into this conversation. The room seemed to stop breathing. I opened one scanned document on my phone. Not the whole file. Just a single page. I'd kept copies because life had taught me never to trust memory when someone else relied on performance. The document showed the settlement agreement, including the financial claim I'd voluntarily waived. Then I opened a screenshot showing one of the bank transfers I'd made toward a debt Vanessa had spent years telling people I'd abandoned her with. I didn't pass my phone around the table. I showed it only to Adrian. And then to Catherine. They were the only two people who were asking honest questions instead of defending opinions they'd already decided to keep. I'd barely finished showing them the documents when Catherine's expression changed. Her lips pressed together tightly, and Adrian looked like someone had just yanked the rug out from under him before asking him to compliment the floor. I turned my phone over so the screen faced down. That's enough, I said. I didn't come here to spread old divorce paperwork across the dinner table. But I'm done letting people call me small just so Vanessa can feel brave. Vanessa's eyes had started to glisten. I'd seen that look before. It was the familiar shift from confident to wounded. Her voice picked up that slight tremble that always seemed to make people forget she'd been the one holding the knife only minutes earlier. You're cruel, she said. No. I met her eyes. If I wanted revenge, I'd tell everyone everything. This isn't revenge. I'm correcting the part of the story you keep using to humiliate me. Catherine turned toward Vanessa without looking away. Were you aware of all this while you were laughing at him? Vanessa said nothing. That silence hurt her more than anything I could have added. Adrian slowly closed the fundraiser packet sitting in front of him. When he finally spoke, his voice stayed calm. That somehow made it even worse. What exactly did you tell me about him? Vanessa spun toward him as if he'd betrayed her. Are you serious right now? Yes. I told you about my experience. You told me he was nothing. I never said that. Adrian's jaw tightened. You said enough. Across the table, Natalie suddenly found the edge of her napkin incredibly interesting. The rest of our old friends looked uncomfortable. Not in the kind of way that makes people realize they've hurt someone and want to make it right. It was the kind of embarrassment that comes from realizing you laughed along with the crowd, and now everyone knows it. I pushed my chair back and stood up. Catherine looked at me with concern. Ethan. I'm okay, I said. Vanessa let out a sarcastic scoff. Of course. Just walk away. That's what you always do. I slid my chair neatly back into place. No, Vanessa. That's what I should have done years ago. Before the evening could collapse into a shouting match, I walked out. I never turned around to see who was watching me leave. I didn't need that picture. I already knew what a room sounded like after everyone lost their appetite. Outside, the cold air hit me hard enough to clear my head. I crossed the parking lot toward my car while loosening my tie with one hand. My phone buzzed twice in my pocket. I ignored it. Just as I reached my car, I heard heels clicking quickly behind me. Ethan. I turned around. Vanessa was hurrying toward me with her arms folded against the cold. Her face was tight with anger. Under the parking lot lights, she looked different. Less polished. More real. Not gentler. Just without the careful editing. You had no right, she snapped. I had every right to correct a lie about me. You humiliated me in front of my husband. You humiliated me in front of an entire table and expected me to keep helping you do it. She laughed, but it broke halfway through. Oh, please. You loved that. You loved making me look stupid. I shook my head. No. I hated that it had to happen. It didn't have to. You're right. You could have stopped talking. Her face twisted. For just a second, I saw the Vanessa I used to know so well. The one who could make me feel guilty simply for noticing the knife sticking out of my own back. You ruined my marriage tonight. I slowly shook my head again. No. You built your marriage on a version of the past that couldn't survive the truth. She glanced back toward the restaurant before looking at me again. Adrian's going to think I lied about everything. Did you? Once again. She didn't answer. Out there in the parking lot, the silence felt completely different. Inside the restaurant, silence had been heavy with pressure. Outside, it felt like freedom. Her voice became quieter. Why couldn't you just let it go? That almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny, because I'd let so much go over the years that she'd mistaken my patience for unlimited storage. I did let it go, I said. For years. You used my silence as a place to store your lies. I'm done carrying them. Her eyes filled with tears. I didn't step toward her. That was something new for me. The old version of me would have softened automatically. The old Ethan would have tried to make things easier for the person who'd caused the pain. She looked at me quietly. You've changed. No. I just stopped volunteering for the same role. I got into my car and shut the door before she had a chance to respond. By the time I arrived home, the old group chat had suddenly come back to life for the first time in months. The chat still had some ridiculous name we'd come up with years earlier during a weekend trip that hardly anyone even remembered anymore. As I poured myself a glass of water in the kitchen, my phone kept lighting up on the counter. I let the messages pile up before reading them. Some were exactly what I'd expected. I had no idea. That really got out of hand. I'm sorry if I laughed. I honestly thought it was just harmless teasing. Then I saw a message from someone who hadn't spoken to me directly since the divorce. For whatever it's worth, I'm sorry we believed everything without ever asking you. I read that one twice. Not because it fixed anything. It didn't. But because it finally named a real problem. They hadn't simply believed Vanessa. They'd chosen not to ask me because asking questions might have made everything less entertaining. Natalie called 3 times. I ignored every call. Then her texts started coming. Ethan, I honestly didn't know things were like that. A minute later, another message appeared. Vanessa told me those things, and I believed her. I'm sorry. Then came the part that sounded exactly like Natalie. But you have to admit, tonight was pretty intense. Before she could send anything else, I blocked her number. Around midnight, Derek called. That one I answered. Well, he said, you were right. I usually am. But you'll have to be more specific. I sat down at my kitchen table. The same table where he'd eaten takeout a few weeks earlier while warning me not to walk into Vanessa's performance unprepared. She tried turning me into the punchline again. Adrian asked what I do for work. It turned out his project was being reviewed by my group. Derek went silent for a second. Then he asked, please tell me you handled it cleanly. I told him, you pitched me last month. Derek let out a long breath. That's beautiful. I'm proud of you. Despite everything, I smiled. I didn't yell. Good. If you'd yelled, it would have helped her. Facts don't. I filled him in on the rest. Not every single detail. Just enough. Catherine speaking up. Adrian's reaction. Vanessa confronting me in the parking lot. When I'd finished, Derek stayed quiet for a moment. Finally, he asked, so, how do you feel? I looked around my kitchen. The glass of water sitting beside me. My keys resting on the counter. My phone still buzzing with messages from people trying to figure out whether they were actually sorry or simply uncomfortable. Tired, I admitted. But, lighter. That sounds about right. The next morning, Vanessa made a vague post online. Some men can never accept that a woman outgrew them. Real healing means refusing to apologize for choosing better. It was exactly the kind of post she'd always make. Soft lighting. I noticed something about Vanessa's post right away. She never used anyone's name. There was just enough detail for people to figure out who she meant, but not enough for anyone to call her out without looking like they were causing drama. Usually, that worked for her. This time, it didn't. Catherine was the first person to comment. Stories have a way of changing when everyone in the room witnessed the same thing. A little later, someone else who'd been at the dinner added another comment. There's a big difference between moving on and rewriting history. Within a few hours, the entire post disappeared. I never responded. I didn't have to. A few days later, I heard something through work. Adrian's team had decided to pause discussions with our funding group. It wasn't because I'd threatened anyone. I hadn't. I never made a phone call. I never sent an email. And I certainly wasn't interested in letting old personal issues influence business decisions. From what I heard, Adrian had simply asked to postpone the next meeting while his team reviewed some internal presentation issues. That was the professional way of saying he'd realized his wife had encouraged him to disrespect someone whose opinion actually mattered. I wouldn't say I felt sorry for Adrian, but I understood the expression I'd seen on his face that night. There's a unique kind of embarrassment that comes from realizing your confidence was built on someone else's version of the truth. It's even worse when the person who gave you that version is sitting beside you, acting shocked that the truth still has consequences. Vanessa tried reaching out one more time. 2 days after I blocked Natalie, a text arrived from a number I didn't recognize. You didn't have to make me look like a liar. I knew it was Vanessa before I even finished reading. I looked at the message for a long time. Finally, I typed a single reply. I didn't make you look like anything. I just stopped helping you hide it. Then I blocked that number too. What surprised me most afterward wasn't Vanessa. It was everyone else. People who hadn't invited me anywhere in years suddenly wanted to grab coffee. The same people who'd laughed about my small life now wanted to hear what I'd been doing. One guy even messaged me saying we should reconnect properly, as though our friendship had simply gotten misplaced instead of quietly being discarded because Vanessa's version of me had been easier to believe. I turned down every invitation. Not angrily, not dramatically. I simply told people I was keeping my circle smaller these days and wished them the best. The old version of me would have seen those invitations as proof that everything had finally been repaired. I would have shown up. I'd have smiled. I'd have tried to make everyone comfortable again. And I'd have quietly helped people feel better about themselves for welcoming me back once they realized my name carried influence. But that wasn't respect. It was weather. When they thought I had no power, they turned cold. The moment they realized I did, they suddenly warmed up. I wasn't interested in standing outside waiting for the temperature to change again. About a week after the dinner, I met Derek for coffee. He slid into the booth across from me, studied my face for a couple of seconds, and grinned. You look annoyingly peaceful. Sorry to disappoint you. I was hoping for that post-revenge glow. I think what you're seeing is just actual sleep. He laughed. That's even better. I told him I deleted the old group chat. I hadn't left with a dramatic speech. I hadn't sent one final message. I'd simply erased the conversation from my phone because I was tired of checking into a room I no longer wanted to be part of. Derek nodded approvingly. That might be the healthiest thing you've done all year. Probably. He stirred his coffee for a moment. Any part of you feel bad? I gave the question some honest thought. I felt bad that years of marriage had ultimately unraveled around a dinner table with my phone sitting between us. I felt bad that people we'd once considered friends had reduced our history to entertainment. I even felt bad that Adrian had been forced to discover, in front of everyone, that his wife had rewritten her past to make him feel like the grand prize. But there was one thing I didn't regret. Speaking. No, I finally answered. Not for telling the truth. Derek lifted his coffee cup toward me. Good. The thing people like Vanessa count on isn't that nobody will ever challenge them. They count on the fact that challenging them usually looks messier than staying quiet. They rely on decent people refusing to make a scene. They hide behind your restraint. And when you finally step out from under it, they act shocked. For years, I convinced myself that dignity meant allowing people to misunderstand me as long as I personally knew the truth. Now I see it differently. Sometimes dignity also means knowing when the truth deserves a witness. I never wanted Vanessa back. I didn't want her marriage. I didn't want her friends. And I definitely didn't want the carefully performed version of success she kept putting on for people who applauded far too easily. All I wanted was my own name back. And that night, I got it back without ever raising my voice. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a comment and support the channel by subscribing. I'll see you in the next story.